Creating these classes requires equipment and services that cost money. If you appreciate this education, please think about going to elithecomputerguy.com and offering a one-time or monthly recurring donation. Welcome back. As you know, I am Eli the Computer Guy, and in today's class, we're going to be doing a brief introduction to Application Programming Interfaces, or APIs. So APIs are ways that you can connect to vendors, products, services, or infrastructure in order to utilize them for your own code. Now, you probably think about APIs with services such as Twitter. So Twitter is a social media site. So let's say you have a WordPress blog, and every time you create a new post, you want a tweet to be sent out over Twitter. Well, you can use Twitter's API, and basically you can have your WordPress blog connect to Twitter using that API, and then whenever you create a post, the title for the post, let's say a thumbnail for the post, a little excerpt from the post, will automatically be bundled together, and your WordPress blog will be able to use the API to then be able to publish that as a tweet on Twitter. So that's one of the ways that people think about using APIs. So all an API is basically it is the way that you are able to programmatically be able to access and utilize services from different vendors. Now, when you think about APIs, you may be thinking about the old days of APIs, right? So a lot of IT professionals, network engineers and sysadmins, they don't really think about APIs a lot because they think of that as just as like the developer world, right? If you want your application to connect to Facebook, if you want your application to connect to Twitter, if you want your application to connect to things like YouTube and all that kind of thing, people think, okay, well, then you need to know APIs, but I'm a real, I'm an IT person. I don't need to worry about APIs. But one of the interesting things is as the world has moved on, is that APIs have become more and more important for old line system administrators and network administrators and that type of thing. Because APIs have been created so that system administrators and old time IT can actually access services that they would have had to spin up servers for in the past. So that's where you hear about in the modern world of something called SOA, or service-oriented architecture. And in a service-oriented architecture, we're no longer worried about physical servers themselves or virtual servers themselves. We're thinking more about just the service, right? So in the old days, back 20 years ago, if I needed an email service, right, I need to be able to send out emails from my application or from something else, I would build a physical machine. I would install an operating system onto that physical machine. I would then install the email server, Exchange or whatever else onto that physical machine, and then I, as a system administrator, was responsible for the hard drive and the operating system and the server software and any of the configurations. Well, now, again, it is now the future. It is now the future, and the idea of having to actually build a physical machine in order to get access to things such as email services seems a little bit ridiculous. And so now, like with APIs, there's a company called SendGrid that was purchased by another company called Twilio. So if you need email services, instead of actually building your own physical email server or even spinning up a virtual email server, using an API, you can simply connect to SendGrid's email services, and then your software or your systems or whatever are able to send email out simply using their infrastructure. So you don't have to worry about the physical machine. You don't have to worry about the CPU fan failing. You don't have to worry about a hard drive fan failing. You don't have to worry about doing updates or firewalls or any of that kind of thing. You can simply have your software be able to connect to SendGrid services, and then basically your software is able to send out emails using SendGrid's API to send emails out. So this can be very valuable for things like notification systems. So let's say you have a backup system in your company, right? You're backing up your servers. If a backup fails for some reason, you want an email to be sent out. Well, you can either build your own email server or have that notification connect to your secure email server that you already have, which, you want to be careful about. It might be more valuable to have your email or your backup system when it needs to email something out, simply connect to SendGrid services so that when an email notification needs to be sent, it can just connect to SendGrid through the API, and then the email will be sent out. Or if you're looking at a company like Twilio, so Twilio, again, purchased SendGrid. Twilio offers a lot of like telephony messaging services. So again, let's say you want to send out SMS messages, right? So basically text messages. Do you really want to build a physical server and figure out how you're going to send out SMS messages? That's going to be very time consuming. It's going to be very expensive. And it's going to be a pain in the butt. Or you can simply connect to Twilio's API, and then your notification system can simply connect, send out the messages based off the phone number or whatever else, and within a day everything is up and running. Again, you don't have to worry about firewalls, you don't have to worry about CPU fans, you don't have to worry about any of that type of thing. So that's what we're starting to talk about, like when we're talking about APIs. A lot of people have the old idea, like the decade-old idea of APIs are about Twitter, APIs about Facebook, that type of thing. But APIs now really are about a lot of the old school services that have simply been so commoditized. I mean, just commoditized to a degree that now you're just connecting, and for $10 a month or something, you're able to pay for 10,000 or 100,000 SMS messages going out. So that's the first thing to be thinking about if you're old school IT. The other thing to be thinking about is these APIs are so useful, and people are getting so used to coding, is that now there are a lot of APIs for actual equipment itself. So when we think about things like software-defined networking, SDN, this is where we're able to manage our network infrastructure using code programmatically. Well, in order to do that, there has to be an API. There has to be a way to have your code actually connect into your physical network infrastructure. So companies such as Cisco actually has APIs for much of their physical equipment. So if you want quality of service, changes, if you want routing changes, if you need to have any changes done to your physical network infrastructure, you can actually connect with APIs and be able to change how routing is done, how different configurations are done, so on and so forth, simply using APIs. And so this is one of the things you need to be thinking about. Again, how time has changed. The old days of just thinking about APIs with Facebook and Twitter and YouTube, that's old school. Again, modern IT, you're now looking at more of this service-oriented architecture. And so if your infrastructure needs SMS services, instead of building a physical box and trying to figure out how to make that work, you can simply connect to an API to Twilio. Again, if you want to be able to programmatically manage your Cisco equipment, you can connect to your Cisco equipment using an API, and then depending on the code you wrote, audit your code. Make sure you audit the hell out of that code if you're managing your network infrastructure, but then programmatically, you can actually manage your network infrastructure. So this is why APIs are very important now, not simply for old school developers and all that type of thing, but also for old school sysadmins, network people, and that type of folk. I would argue at this point in time, learning APIs now is much like learning Linux 10 or 15 years ago, right? So again, back when I got my MCSE, all I had to know was Windows. I didn't have to know Mac. I didn't have to know Linux. I sure as hell didn't have to know Unix, right? If all you knew was Windows 20 years ago, that was A-okay. As time went by, as Linux became more prominent, as there were more and more services that used Linux, then it became more important that if you're going to be a system administrator, you needed to be comfortable with Linux. Again, setting up a file server, setting up any kind of Linux server, you needed to be comfortable with, 10, 15 years ago. I would argue the same is now true with system administrators with being able to use APIs. You need to be comfortable with it. You need to have a basic understanding of how you connect to these APIs for different services, and you should have a basic understanding of how to be able to code, at least a little bit of code, in order to make these APIs function, just like you had to learn Linux before. That would be my thought with APIs today. Now, when you start thinking about using APIs, there are a few considerations you're going to have to keep in mind. The first consideration with APIs is basically what programming language are you going to use in order to connect to the API. Again, it's an application programming interface, which means you're going to need a programming language. Is that going to be PHP? Is that going to be Ruby? Is that going to be Python? Is that going to be Java? Is it going to be C#? Is it going to be any of these programming languages? And guess what the answer is. When you say, Eli, what programming language do I need to know in order to use an API? I'm going to give you a shocking answer. Go do a Google search, pull up the service you want to use, pull up the information for their APIs, and see what programming languages that they allow to connect to their service. It's very important to understand with how these APIs work that basically they create the APIs and then they design the APIs to only work with certain programming languages. So whether it's Python, whether it's PHP, whether it's C#, whether it's Java, whatever else, basically they're going to create their API and they're going to say our API works with A, B, and C. So if you're going to use our API, you have to use that programming language. I would argue, I think this is one of the reasons why Python became so popular if you go back 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, because when a lot of these APIs were being debuted for people to use, the fact of the matter is, back then, many times the only API language that was available was Python. They would come out with the API. Again, you go back 5, 6, 7 years ago, a lot of these APIs were brand new. Again, coming up with things takes time, money, energy, so on and so forth. So they've got to prioritize. These companies have to prioritize for what language they want to target. And for a lot of these companies, they simply targeted Python from day one. And so if you wanted to use an API, you had to use Python. I would argue that is when the value of PHP really started falling off a cliff. Not the quality of whether PHP is good, not any of that type of stuff. The fact of the matter was, for 10 years, PHP gave you access to most of the things that you needed when you're creating web applications. Again, you go back 6 or 7 years ago, all these brand new APIs come out. Really cool, right? If you want to connect your website or whatever to Facebook or Twitter or anything else, in order to do that, you have to know Python. So all of a sudden, everybody learns Python. Why? If you want the API, you got to use Python. So the important thing, whatever service that you want to use with their API, basically just go take a look at what languages they support and then pick the language that works best for you. So it is very important, and this is one of the things you have to be thinking about. There's a lot of vendors out there for any kind of service: email services, SMS services, storage services, any kind of service that would be provided with a service-oriented architecture. There's probably 10 different vendors out there that offer a solution. So something that one of the things that you may have to think about is, what languages do you know, right? I know PHP, I know JavaScript, I know Python or something like that. You take a look at these different vendors. Some vendors will support the languages you know. Some vendors may not support the languages you know. And so one of the ways that you literally pick what vendor you're going to go with is, what language do you already know. Past that, one of the things you also have to look at with these APIs is, what is the cost for using the API? Now, the cool thing is, again, this has been commoditized to such a degree. Something like 10,000 emails, or I'm not even 10,000. 10,000 emails now is actually, I think it's a free service. If you send out 10,000 emails a month from SendGrid, I recall right now it's actually so commoditized that's free. If you send out like 100,000 or hundreds of thousands of emails, that might cost you $10 a month. But one of the things that you're going to have to look at is, what is the cost for using the API? Again, if you have a website like EliTheComputerGuy.com, so I have a website called EliTheComputerGuy.com, you can sign up for membership. I use an API in order to send out the emails. Again, why build my own email server? So on a site like that, frankly, it sends out thousands of emails a month. So I know what my cost for a website like EliTheComputerGuy.com is. Something that you may be thinking about, that you may have to think about, though, is if you're going to be doing a website or some kind of service that sends out a lot of emails. So again, let's say some kind of news blast service, you're going to be creating a startup company. So some of these startup companies now, instead of creating websites, they're actually doing newsletters. Like, newsletters is the new black. I don't know, whatever's old becomes new, and new goes to old. So one of the things, there are actually some startup companies out there that their subscription newsletter services. Well, something to be thinking about is, if the business that you're going to be supporting, they're sending out, again, hundreds of thousands or millions of emails per month, or maybe even per week or something like that, a cost that for me is irrelevant may actually become very significant in your particular situation. The other thing, too, to be thinking about is, again, how many times are you going to be hitting the API? So are you going to be using the API, once per day per user? Are you going to be hitting the API every 10 seconds? Are you going to be hitting the API every 1 second? So something to be thinking about is the timings, right? So if you get, let's say, 100,000 API calls for $20 or something per month, something to be thinking about is, if you're making an API call every second, you're going to hit that 100,000 mark a lot sooner than if you do it every 10 seconds or every minute or every 5 minutes or every 10 minutes. So something you need to be thinking about when you write your code is being conservative with how many times you actually have to make the API call. That's one of the things to be thinking about, is with cost. The other thing to be thinking about with those API calls is the limits that are imposed on you. So some of these services impose hard limits. I was looking at one today, and it's like, if you do 10,000 calls in an hour, you'll start getting errors after that. You'll just get 404 errors. And so that is something to keep in mind is, again, what are going to be the hard limits for using these APIs? Are you going to run into problems or not? And then Those are some of the things that you basically have to be thinking about when you're going to be using these APIs. You think about the language, you think about the cost, you think about any kind of hard limits or caps there. And then again, like I say, with that, you go and you figure out which vendor supports what you need. So now that I've given you a brief idea of what APIs are and why you should be thinking about APIs, let's go over to the computer just so I can show you a couple of examples of what APIs exist in the real world. So here we are. The first API to take a look at is this company called Twilio. If you have not looked at Twilio before, you need to look at Twilio. Twilio is a cool company. Twilio is one of those things where even if you have no use for it, you should take a look at what they're doing, because what they're doing is really cool. Though you go up here, you can see they have lots of different products: programmable SMS, voice, SendGrid, so that email API I was talking about, authentication as an API. They've got a whole bunch of different things here. So we can click on programmable SMS. So again, if you wanted to send out SMS messages, basically text messages, this would be a way for you to do it. We can go here, oops, minimize that, and we can click on their API. And here it kind of gives you some examples of how you would use their API with code. Again, when we take a look at what programming languages you are able to use, you will see they have an option for PHP, they have an option for Node, Python, Ruby, Java, and .NET C#. And you say, what about something else? Like, doesn't matter. What about it? They don't have it, right? So we can take a look here. Basically, we can take a look at their PHP code. You see they open up the PHP script. They do a require, they use. Then a couple of things down here is you're most likely, whenever you're going to do be using an API, there's going to be some kind of like a session ID or a user ID type of thing, an SID. And so you have your identification here, some type of token. So basically, again, this is for security. So basically, you're setting up the security, you're setting up your connection. Then with client, you're going to create a message. This message is going to go to this particular phone number. Then it's going to say the message is from this particular phone number. It's going to be the body here, and then it's going to have a bit of media. So basically some kind of image is going to be sent. So basically this kind of shows you in PHP how you would use the Twilio API in order to send out a text message. Then they show you in Node, then they show you in Python, show you in Ruby, Java, and .NET. And again, this is where I say, like in the real world, you can just do a lot of copy and pasting. Like when you're going to do code, if it was me, I would just copy this, paste it into my code, modify this how I see fit, and now my code, whatever I've created, is now able to send out SMS messages. So that's Twilio with SMS. If we go up, you can see things like there's a free Geo IP service. So a Geo IP service is it takes the IP address and tells you what the geographic location of that IP address is. Let's be clear, supposed to be. This can be spoofed, but basically the idea is it tells you what the location of the IP address is supposed to be, and so they have an HTTP API for this, and you can go and you can take a look and see how this is going to be used. Again, this is a free service, so this service is free, doesn't cost any money, but again, just something to think about. 10,000 queries per hour by default. Once this limit is reached, your request will result in 403 forbidden until your quota is cleared. And so this may run you into some problems with your code, right? You may not be thinking about it. Your application is scaling up. You're getting far more users than you were first expecting. And then all of a sudden, you're going to start getting a lot of garbage in your database, because once you hit that 10,000 queries per hour limit, then it's going to just be giving you back a 403 error. So that's just something to be thinking about there. Past that, we can go over, we can take a look at Cisco. So again, Cisco, this is networking equipment. They have network controller APIs, network device APIs, service provider APIs, mobility APIs, data center APIs, collaboration APIs, IoT APIs, security APIs, cloud, so on and so forth. And again, this is where, again, in the coding world, in this modern world of doing IT, you're going to have to do a lot of research. Like so many times nowadays, what you have to do is you have to be sitting there with a cup of coffee thinking about how how could I make my infrastructure work better? What service would I need in order to make my infrastructure work better? And you just kind of spitball and you think about it. And then once you have kind of an idea of what you're looking for, then you can go out and you can start doing Google searches and see if there are any products or offerings out there that provide whatever service it is that you need. And you'll be surprised, in this modern world, there are a lot of products and services you may not have thought about before. Past that, again, we can go to something like Twitter. So Twitter, this is their API reference, authentication, create and manage lists. And you can see, like with Twitter, you can do almost anything that you want from outside of Twitter to interact with the Twitter system. So they've got all this kind of stuff here. And then finally, again, you go over to something like Facebook. Again, Facebook for developers, they have their Graph API. The Graph API is a primary way for apps to read and write to the Facebook social graph, so on and so forth. So this kind of just gives you a brief idea of the different types of APIs that are out there. And again, there are APIs definitely for Facebook and Twitter, like you're used to, but there's also APIs for Cisco, for actual physical equipment. And then again, for some of these services that you may need, again, messaging services, that type of thing, going with a company like Twilio really may be a great way to go. Again, don't you, instead of spinning up a physical server, installing an operating system, dealing with firewalls, dealing with CPU fans, dealing with all of that, wouldn't it be a lot nicer just to create an account on Twilio, copy and paste a snippet of code and be done with it? let Twilio deal with the CPU fans. At least that's what my opinion is. Now you sit there and looking at this and you go, wow, this is awesome. This is great. This is all upside. Eli, I'm so happy you showed me a product or service where there's no problems at all. There is no possible downside to this. This is great. Inexpensive or free services that make my infrastructure better. Great. I'm all in. I do have to warn you though, again, this is the IT world, this is the technology world, and nothing's perfect. Nothing. If you think there's no downside, it only means you don't know enough to understand what the downside is. There's always a downside to everything. And so when you start looking at these APIs and you start thinking about using these APIs for your infrastructure, one of the big things you have to think about with these APIs is that you have no control over the vendor's infrastructure and how the vendor allows you to access that infrastructure. This became a really big problem a number of years ago when a lot of apps were created in order to interact with Twitter. So one of the reasons that Twitter became so popular so fast so many years ago is they had a very open, very loose API. Basically, any 9-year-old could create code, connect to the Twitter API, and away they went. And so one of the cool parts about that is there were a lot of apps, there were a lot of like web apps that were created in order to interact with Twitter that were very new, that were very interesting, that got a lot of people motivated to use Twitter. Unfortunately, as what happens with a lot of these Silicon Valley companies, they got greedy and they got stupid. One of the reasons that I would argue Twitter has fallen so far behind so many of the other social media companies out there is because what they did is at one point they said, well, wait a minute, if all of these apps are connecting to our Twitter infrastructure and they're making money, wait a minute, that's money we should be making. Why are we allowing them to take a free ride when we should be making that money? And so Twitter really quickly shut down and restricted the hell out of their API. And basically, a lot of these companies, a lot of these startups that have been created based off of using the Twitter API, they died overnight. They literally could not pivot fast enough to get out of the destruction of what that API change caused for them. And so this is something that you need to be thinking about when you're going to be using your APIs, these APIs for your infrastructure or whatever else, is realize that the rules and stuff can change at any point in time. And so that's why it's important. Like, you look at the reputation of companies. So again, like with SendGrid and Twilio, these companies have been around for a long time. I feel comfortable using them. I would use them if I'm building up a project, again, because their reputation is rock solid. Twitter, Facebook,
I mean, you know, if I've got some extra money, I've got some extra coders hanging around, and I want to create something that'll connect into Twitter or Facebook. Yeah, sure, I may connect to their API, but I will do it with the knowledge that the people that run those companies feel at any time they can change all the rules, they can shut things down, they can make modifications, and they feel no responsibility for that. You're using our infrastructure, we can do whatever the hell we want. So that's one of those things you have to be careful about. And again, that's when you go out there and you're looking for different vendors to use for APIs. Think about the reputation. How long have they been around for? Do they make major changes? Again, this is an important thing to be thinking about. Do they pivot all the time? Are they some kind of, infrastructure as a service company that every year is pivoting? So the question you have to ask yourself is, what happens if next year they pivot out of whatever the hell we're using, right? So something to be thinking about is beyond just the language, beyond just the cost, is how much do you trust the reputation of these companies? The final thing you have to be thinking about in this modern world of worrying about government surveillance and other types of surveillance is one of the things you have to be thinking about, especially for these communication services, is realize your control ends at the API. Right? Your control ends at the API. When you're providing data to the API for these companies' infrastructure, many times you have no control of how they're using that data once it goes into their system, right? So if you want to write a tweet to Twitter, obviously your API is able to, or your program is able to connect to their API, and then it feeds the information. But you have no control over what else it does with that information. Again, if you're thinking about something like using that free GeoIP API that I just showed you, realize they could be logging things that you're not expecting them to log. So they're able to log, what website or what application is this coming from. Then they're able to log client information. Then they're able to log the IP address, obviously with the geography and all that. So that 10,000 requests per hour, you're like, wow, why would these people give me 10,000, GeoIP requests per hour? That is so generous of them. But the other way you could be thinking about it is that they're logging 10,000 IP requests per hour, and you don't know what additional information that they're taking. Again, possibly what your website is, possibly information about client systems, anything like that, that goes in their database, and they may be selling that onwards in a way that you're not expecting. So something that you really have to understand when you're using the API. The good part about using APIs is that you don't have to worry about CPU fans failing. Yay! The bad part about APIs is you have no idea what additional logging, what additional things they're doing with the data that you're feeding the API. And so you just do have to consider that in the modern world. So those are some things to be thinking about with APIs. Again, in the modern world, in the service-oriented architecture world, APIs are awesome. Again, why do I want to build a physical machine, install an operating system, deal with firewalls, deal with antivirus, deal with updates, deal with all that kind of stuff in order to be able to send out SMS messages, right? I'd rather be able to copy 20 lines of code, be able to modify it how I see fit, create an account with one of these services, and pay $10 a month. And really, that's what you have to be thinking about, right? If you're going to be building a server, a physical server is probably going to cost you at least $1,000 plus the time and anything else that's required in order to actually get the thing up and running. And so again, you go to Twilio and it costs you $10 a month for a service, right? That's a decade. It's the time to pay back in order for the physical server to actually make sense financially, literally might be 10 years or more. And so this is something to be important to be thinking about. A lot of people say, well, no, I want my own physical boxes. But seriously, for email services, for SMS services, for a lot of these other services, simply being able to connect to an API will make your life a lot easier. Now, from the security standpoint, again, one of the things that you do have to be concerned about is you have no idea how these companies are logging information once it goes through their API. And so one of the things that you should be thinking about is ask yourself, what data do you really want? What information do you really want to send to these APIs? One of the big problems I see from a security standpoint in the modern world is, frankly, these coders are just lazy and they don't think about things, and they just send way too much crap to the API. TMI, right? Think about what does that API actually need in order to provide the service that you require? And, what are you just feeding the API just because you didn't think about scaling back the information, right? Just like when you go to a dinner party, you don't need to start telling everybody about the problems with your sex life with your spouse and your kids are doing drugs and everything else. When you go to a dinner party and people say, "How's it going?" You give them as much information as they need. Well, things are going okay, right? And then if you're talking to a family member or a good friend, they say, "Hey, you want to go out for a beer sometime? Do you want to talk about it?" And then you may provide more information. But if some random person comes up to you, you don't just start spilling everything, right? TMI. Same is true with these APIs. Somebody really be thinking about, if you're worried about security, if you're worried about your data and how it gets used, is think, okay, what information do I need to feed to these APIs? Am I doing the programmatic equivalent of TMI? And if you are, then just scale back what you feed to the APIs or do some kind of anonymization process or something like that. Again, think about what data you're feeding to their systems. Think about how, basically what you need to be thinking about is always assume they're logging everything that is given to them and that they're selling it. Always assume that. So if you always assume that they're logging everything and selling it, you will send different types of data to the system, right? You'll think about how you do that in a different way, and basically that's what I would recommend. So that is a brief overview of APIs. Again, these are very important in the classical, the standard IT world now, not just for developers. Again, with notification systems, with all kinds of stuff. Again, storage, networking equipment, all of these things, you're now able to interact using these APIs. And I would argue learning APIs now and learning a coding language such as Python, now it's just like 15 years ago learning Linux, right? If you go back to 2005, 2010, it was just completely obvious you had to learn Linux. You just had to learn Linux in order to continue to be a system administrator, to be in the IT world. I would argue the same is true now with APIs, where before, again, you go back 5 or 6 years ago, a lot of these APIs were brand new. Maybe you knew it, maybe you didn't really matter. Going forward, I would argue you're going to need to start learning how these APIs work. You're going to need to start learning some kind of coding language such as Python so that you can interact with them. And within a couple of years, it's just going to be a normal thing that has to be on the resume if it's not already now. So, as always, I enjoyed doing this class and look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Apparently, the type of content you just saw is not what Susan W. wants for the future of YouTube. This means that recommendations by YouTube to this channel have dropped massively and views are becoming comically small. I hate to ask. I used to say I would never ask, but if you could subscribe, like, comment, and most importantly, share the videos that you appreciate, that may help slow the death of this channel. Do remember that if anything at all happens to this channel, you can go to EliTheComputerGuy.com to view the content and access information not available on YouTube.